In every life, there are stories we keep locked away, secrets too heavy to confess, too delicate to reveal. But in the Café Between Lives, even silence cannot last forever. Tonight, an old man with trembling hands arrives, clutching a silver pocket watch. With every tick, the air shivers, and the truth he buried decades ago demands to be spoken. Some secrets do not die, they wait. Part 1. The Man with the Watch. The Café Between Lives was quieter than usual that evening. A soft rain tapped against the tall windows, turning the city lights into long streaks of gold and silver. The few patrons scattered among the tables spoke in hushed voices, as though the very air encouraged reverence. The door opened slowly, accompanied by the faint chime of a bell that seemed older than the cafe itself. An elderly man stepped inside. His shoulders were stooped, not only from age, but from the weight of something unseen. His gray coat was damp at the edges, and in his right hand he clutched a silver pocket watch so tightly his knuckles shone white. The watch ticked audibly, louder than it should have, each second cutting through the cafe's gentle murmur, like a metronome commanding attention. A few patrons glanced up, then quickly looked away, sensing that this was not an ordinary arrival. The man, Thomas, paused by the doorway, eyes adjusting to the warm amber light of the cafe. His face bore deep creases, the kind carved not only by years, but by silence. He scanned the room as if searching for someone he both dreaded and longed to meet. Finally, he shuffled toward a small table near the corner, his steps unsteady, each one echoing faintly more than it should. The young waiter, the same one who had guided countless lost souls through their unfinished stories, approached quietly. He noticed at once the trembling hands, the pallor of the man's face, and above all, the watch. "Good evening," the waiter said gently, placing a menu down though he knew Thomas would not read it. "You've come a long way." Thomas nodded but said nothing. He placed the watch on the table, its polished silver case gleaming in the cafe's soft light. The ticking grew sharper, filling the silence between words. Some patrons shifted in their seats, uneasy, as though they too could hear time itself pressing down on them. The waiter's gaze lingered on the object. He had seen letters that glowed, cups that never cooled, even shadows that spoke, but never a watch that seemed alive, commanding the rhythm of the entire room. Thomas finally spoke, his voice rough with disuse. "It never stops, not once in all these years." He glanced at the waiter, his eyes pale blue, clouded with something beyond age, regret, perhaps, or fear. The waiter tilted his head. "And yet you've carried it all this time." A bitter smile touched Thomas's lips. "Carried it? No, it carried me. Every tick a reminder, every hour a weight I couldn't set down." The waiter said nothing more, sensing the man needed space to unravel his own silence. Thomas leaned back, staring at the watch as though it might suddenly break free from the table. The cafe around him seemed to bend subtly toward the sound of the ticking. Lamplight flickered in rhythm. The rain outside pattered in sync. Even the other patrons' conversations fell into uneven fragments, as though time itself hesitated. Thomas closed his eyes briefly, whispering something almost too soft to hear. A name, perhaps. The watch answered with its steady pulse. And in that moment, the Café Between Lives shifted. The air grew thicker, warmer, touched by an unseen current. The waiter knew the story had begun, and the cafe would not rest until the secret bound within that watch was revealed. Part 2. The waiter's curiosity. The young waiter lingered near the table longer than usual. His presence, calm and unobtrusive, had a way of inviting stories to surface without force. He had seen countless travelers arrive in this place, souls weighed down by regret, longing, or unfinished words. But Thomas felt different. His silence wasn't the silence of fear or confusion. was the silence of someone who had practiced hiding for a lifetime. The pocket watch lay between them, like a third guest at the table. Every tick was clear, insistent. The waiter realized it wasn't just loud, it was unnaturally precise, resonating as though each second was meant to be heard not only by Thomas, but by everyone within reach. A few patrons glanced over their shoulders, frowning as if they'd lost track of their own conversations. At last, the waiter spoke. "That's a fine piece you have there. Old, but well cared for." Thomas opened his eyes and looked at him sharply. "Fine. No. Cursed, perhaps." He let out a breath, long and uneven, and his fingers trembled as they hovered above the watch's case. He didn't touch it, as if afraid it might bite. The waiter pulled out a chair and sat opposite him, not something he did for everyone, but here it seemed necessary. "It has a story, then. Most things in this cafe do." Thomas chuckled, though there was no joy in it. "A story? Yes, it has one, but not the kind you tell in the light." The waiter leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on the table. "And yet, this place was made for such stories. You brought it here for a reason, didn't you?" Thomas hesitated, eyes darting toward the window. The rain was still falling, but now it seemed muted, distant, like a memory playing in the background. His hand finally settled on the watch, fingers curling over the cool metal. The ticking quickened, as though sensing his touch. "I didn't bring it here," he said finally. "It brought me." The waiter didn't flinch at the words. The cafe often pulled people in by objects, by unfinished threads that tugged at the soul until they couldn't resist. A letter, a ring, an old photograph, and now, a watch. "What makes it so heavy to carry?" the waiter asked softly. Thomas's jaw clenched. For a long moment he said nothing, his breath shallow, eyes fixed on the shifting reflections in the silver case. When he spoke again, his voice was almost a whisper. "Because it ticks for someone else, not for me. Every second that passes, it reminds me of him." The waiter tilted his head. "Him?" Thomas nodded slowly, eyes clouding. The boy who should have had this watch. The boy whose time was stolen before it began." The air in the cafe thickened. The lamps flickered once, twice, as if the building itself acknowledged the weight of the confession. A sudden stillness fell over the other patrons. Forks froze halfway to lips. Cups hovered just before a sip. All of them were suspended, listening without knowing they were. The waiter's voice was calm, but carried a quiet gravity. And who was this boy? Thomas's hand tightened around the watch. His throat worked, struggling with words he had swallowed for decades. Finally, he whispered, "My son." The tick of the watch seemed to grow louder, filling the room like a drumbeat of truth long denied. Part 3. The cafe reacts. The moment the word son left Thomas's lips, the cafe stirred. It wasn't loud, not like a storm breaking glass or thunder splitting the sky. Instead, it was subtle, a shift in the very air. The lamps hanging from the ceiling flickered in rhythm with the ticking watch. Their golden glow brightened and dimmed, as though responding to each beat of the silver timepiece. The rain outside grew slower, the streaks on the glass stretching unnaturally, as if the world beyond the windows had forgotten how to move forward. The waiter sat still, hands folded loosely on the table, watching the transformation with quiet understanding. He had seen this before. The cafe listened. It always listened. And when a story demanded to be told, it shaped itself into a stage. Thomas seemed startled by the changes. He looked around, eyes wide, his chest rising and falling in uneven rhythm. What's happening? His fingers gripped the watch harder, as though it were both the cause and his only anchor. "The cafe," the waiter said softly. "It's hearing you. It wants the truth as much as you do." Around them, the few patrons shifted. Some froze mid-motion, locked in strange stillness, their cups held just inches from their lips. Others blurred slightly, like candle flames in a draft, as if their outlines were no longer fixed. The air smelled faintly of old wood and rain-soaked stone, but beneath it lingered another scent, oil, iron, and the faint tang of brass shavings, like a workshop waiting just out of sight. Thomas shuddered. It's pulling me back. The waiter nodded. Because the watch doesn't belong here. Not really. Not until its story is told. The watch on the table ticked faster now, each second tumbling over the next. And then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence was so sharp it cut. And in that silence, a sound replaced it. Faint hammering, the delicate whir of gears, the whisper of tiny tools turning brass and steel. The cafe's walls seemed to blur, bending into the faint outline of a workshop. Wooden benches appeared in ghostly form along the edges of the room, shelves lined with glass jars of screws and springs. A half-finished clock ticked quietly in the corner, its pendulum swaying in defiance of the frozen rain outside. Thomas's breath caught, his eyes filled with something raw, pain, memory, and recognition. "I know this place," he whispered. His voice cracked. It was mine. The waiter turned his gaze toward the vision forming around them. "Then perhaps it is time to return." The workshop bled into the cafe, two worlds merging, one superimposed over the other. Patrons sat among phantom tools, their faces expressionless, unbothered by the intrusion of another reality. But Thomas saw it clearly, painfully. His hand trembled over the watch, as if afraid to let go, afraid that if he did, the memory would consume him whole. The ticking resumed, softer now, but no longer from the watch. It came from the air itself, from the walls, from the faint shimmer of the past taking shape. Thomas whispered a single word, heavy as a prayer, as the ghost of a wooden door appeared before him, leading deeper into the vision. Home. Part 4. A glimpse of the past. The wooden door in the vision creaked open, though no one had touched it. A warm light spilled through, carrying with it the unmistakable smell of oil, varnished oak, and the faint tang of metal dust. The cafe seemed to fold itself into this memory, its walls bending like parchment, reshaping into the outlines of a modest workshop. Thomas's breath grew shallow. His knuckles whitened as he clutched the silver watch. "I haven't seen this place in decades." He stepped forward, though his chair hadn't moved. The paradox of the cafe, how one could walk without rising, how one could touch the past without leaving the present, made it possible. His fingers brushed the ghostly edge of a workbench, and for a moment, the sensation was real. Rough wood, cool metal shavings beneath his fingertips. The waiter remained seated across from him, though his eyes followed Thomas's every motion. "Tell me," he said softly, "what do you see?" Thomas swallowed. "Everything. The clocks, the tools, my father's old lathe in the corner. I was just a boy when I first worked here. I thought the world could be fixed if you could just keep its gears in order. Foolish, wasn't it?" The sound of ticking surrounded them now, dozens of phantom clocks striking slightly out of sync, creating a strange, uneven harmony. The cafe guests sat in silence, still frozen in their suspended reality, as though honoring the scene. And then, among the shadows of the workshop, movement. A boy, no more than 8, appeared. He wasn't clear at first, more like a smudge of light, a memory fighting to take form. But as the watch in Thomas's hand ticked louder, the child sharpened. Curly hair, wide brown eyes, a small satchel slung over one shoulder. Thomas's lips parted. His voice was a whisper of awe. "That's him. That's Henry." The boy darted between benches, picking up scraps of brass gears, pretending to assemble something grand. His laughter rang out, high and bright, echoing unnaturally loud in the still cafe. Thomas pressed his fist to his chest, as if to hold his breaking heart in place. The waiter tilted his head. "Your son." Thomas nodded slowly. "Yes, he never knew I was his father. I watched him grow from a distance, too much a coward to claim him, too concerned with reputation, with what people might say. And so I let him believe I was only the kind man at the workshop who fixed his school clock." The boy laughed again, and this time Thomas crumpled, his shoulders shaking. His other hand covered his face, muffling a broken sound. "I should have told him. God help me, I should have told him." The vision of Henry turned, and for a fleeting second, his eyes locked with Thomas's. It was impossible. Memories were not supposed to look back. But in the Café Between Lives, impossible things happened when truth clawed its way free. The boy smiled. Small, innocent, unaware of the storm his presence unleashed. And then he faded, dissolving into sparks of golden light that drifted like fireflies. Thomas sobbed once, then clutched the watch so tightly the metal bit into his palm. That was him. That was my boy. I don't deserve to see him again. The waiter's gaze was steady, calm but grave. Perhaps you are here not to decide what you deserve, but to say what was left unsaid. The workshop dissolved slightly, its edges blurring, but the echo of the child's laughter lingered. Thomas sat, hollow and trembling, as though the cafe itself waited for him to gather the courage for what came next. Part 5. The son he never knew. The golden sparks that had been Henry's laughter still drifted through the cafe, suspended like dust caught in sunlight. Thomas reached out, his trembling fingers trying to hold onto them, but they vanished the moment he touched them. His hand fell back to the table with a dull thud, the silver watch gleaming in his palm. The waiter leaned slightly forward, his voice low, steady. "Tell me, Thomas, who was he, truly?" Thomas stared at the watch as if it were an open wound. His lips parted once, twice, before words finally escaped. "Henry was mine, my boy, but the world never knew it." The cafe grew quieter, as though every patron, every flickering lamp leaned in to listen. Even the rain outside seemed to hush, the frozen streaks on the windows softening into faint gray blurs. Thomas's voice shook, but once he began, he could not stop. "It was 1942. I was young then, barely more than a boy myself. I had just taken over this shop from my father when I met her. Eliza. She was radiant, not just beautiful, but alive in a way that made everything else seem dull. She'd come in with her father's broken clock, and by the time I fixed it, I knew my life would never be the same." A faint shimmer appeared beside them, an echo of memory. A young woman with dark hair pinned back, smiling as she leaned across the counter, watching a much younger Thomas turn a gear in his hands. The cafe filled with the faint scent of her perfume, lavender and smoke. "We had a season together," Thomas continued, his voice soft, filled with both longing and regret. "But war loomed over everything. She was promised to another man, respectable, wealthy, approved by her family. And me? I was just a watchmaker, nothing more. She ended it before it could become more than whispers and stolen afternoons." The vision shifted again, showing Eliza in a pale dress, walking away into a rain-soaked street, her figure dissolving into mist. Thomas's throat tightened. He pressed the watch to his forehead, as though begging it to keep him from crumbling. Months later, I heard rumors that she'd had a child, a boy, but no one ever said the father's name, not even her. I knew. God help me, I knew. But I never claimed him. I told myself it was better for him that way. Better to grow up with another man's name than to carry mine. The waiter's eyes didn't soften, but his tone carried weight. "And yet you watched him." "Yes." Thomas's shoulders sagged. "Every chance I had. He used to come to my shop with a broken toy or a cracked school clock. He'd watch me work, curious as a cat. And I wanted to tell him, every single time. But the words," his voice cracked, "the words turned to ash in my mouth." For a brief moment, the boy appeared again in the workshop's ghostly outline, bent over a stool, studying a collection of tiny gears with wide-eyed fascination. The image was so vivid that Thomas nearly reached out. "I made this watch for him," Thomas whispered, holding the silver timepiece up. Its polished surface caught the cafe's dim light. "I thought, someday, when the time was right, I'd give it to him." I imagined his smile, the way he'd hold it, maybe even bring it to his own son one day. The ticking grew heavier, echoing louder through the cafe, until it felt like every heartbeat in the room pulsed in time with it. But I never did. I kept it hidden, waiting for the right time, and then... His voice faltered, breaking completely. "The war came for him. My Henry. My boy." Thomas bowed his head, his shoulders trembling. The cafe's light dimmed, shadows stretching across the floor, as though the room itself mourned alongside him. Part 6. The War and the Loss. The ticking of the silver watch grew louder, filling the cafe like the steady march of boots on cobblestones. Thomas sat hunched, his hands trembling as he clutched the little timepiece, as though it were the last thread binding him to his son. The vision of the workshop wavered, dissolving into something darker, harsher. The low rumble of distant thunder, the red glow of a setting sun that looked more like fire than light. It was no longer a workshop that surrounded him. It was the shadow of a battlefield. "Henry was barely 18 when the draft took him," Thomas whispered. His voice sounded hollow, as if it belonged to a ghost. "He wasn't ready. God, he wasn't ready." The cafe's walls seemed to dissolve completely now. Around them, phantom shapes formed, young men in worn uniforms, their faces pale and tight with fear. Rifles hung in their hands like burdens too heavy to carry. Mud clung to their boots, and the air reeked of smoke, sweat, and iron. And then, among the soldiers, one face sharpened. Henry. Thomas's breath caught. His son stood there in a uniform too large for his frame, his cap slightly askew. Despite the mud and the fear etched into his young features, there was a spark in his eyes, a determination Thomas had never seen before. "I followed the news like a madman," Thomas said, his voice quivering. "Every scrap of paper, every bulletin. I hoped, prayed, begged that he'd be spared. But then, the phantom battlefield erupted with sound, the crack of gunfire, the thunder of distant shells. The boys ducked, scattered, their shouts torn by wind and smoke. Henry ran forward, clutching his rifle, disappearing into the chaos. Thomas surged from his seat, as though he could chase him. "No!" Thomas cried out, his voice breaking. "Don't go! Don't!" But Henry was already gone, swallowed by smoke and fire. The battlefield dissolved, the echoes fading into silence, until only the cafe remained. Its warm lamps flickered as though shaken by the weight of the memory. Thomas sank back into his chair, his face buried in his hands. When the telegram came, he whispered. It was Eliza who received it. I remember standing at her doorstep, too much a coward to knock. I watched her crumble in the window's light, the paper clutched in her hand. And I turned away. I let her mourn alone. I let them both be gone, without ever knowing who I truly was. The silver watch in his palm ticked once more, and then stilled. The sound stopped so suddenly, it was as if time itself had drawn in a breath and refused to exhale. The waiter leaned closer, his voice neither gentle nor cruel, but something deeper, inevitable. "And so you carried this watch, waiting for a moment that never came, waiting until it was too late. Thomas lifted his head, his face streaked with tears. Too late for him, too late for Eliza, and now, too late for me. The cafe was silent again. The other patrons remained frozen in their half-sipped drinks and half-turned smiles, as though the universe had paused, waiting for Thomas to choose what came next. The waiter placed his hands on the table, steady as the wood beneath them. Perhaps the Café Between Lives exists for those who believe it is too late. Thomas's fingers closed around the watch, the metal cold and sharp in his grasp. He did not answer. Not yet. Part 7. A Father's Regret. The cafe was still, the quiet so deep that Thomas could hear the faint rasp of his own breath, the trembling of his heart against his ribs. He held the silver watch so tightly it cut into his palm, leaving a small crescent mark. It was the weight of a lifetime, the only proof of a love he never had the courage to claim. The waiter remained across from him, patient, unreadable. The warm glow of the cafe's lamps flickered once, as though dimming in sympathy, before steadying again. Thomas finally spoke, his voice thick. I've lived my whole life pretending I wasn't his father, pretending it was better that way, pretending I didn't ache every time I saw him in the street, saw him smile, saw him grow into the man I never got to know. I told myself it was mercy, that I was sparing him from shame. But in truth, he bowed his head, his words crumbling to ash. In truth, it was fear, pure cowardice. The air around them shimmered faintly, and a vision rippled into being, not of the battlefield this time, but of a quiet street in the city. Henry, just a boy of 12, ran down the road chasing a ball. He stumbled, scraped his knee, and looked up, right into Thomas's eyes. The memory froze there, Henry's young face wide open, full of trust, waiting for kindness. Thomas's voice broke as he leaned forward, whispering to the vision. I should have said it then, just 3 words, I am yours. But I didn't. I smiled like a stranger and walked away. The vision dissolved, leaving only the watch ticking faintly in his hand. The waiter spoke, his voice steady, like a clock never losing its rhythm. Every man carries regrets, Thomas, but not every man has the chance to face them once more. Thomas swallowed hard, his throat raw. But what good does it do now? He's gone. Eliza's gone. The life I might have had, it's dust. The waiter leaned back, his gaze unblinking. And yet, here you are, in the Café Between Lives. Do you think it chanced that the watch found its way here? Or that you can still see his face so clearly? Thomas stared down at the watch. For the first time, he noticed something strange. Its hands no longer moved forward. They ticked in reverse, each second unwinding, pulling time backward into silence. The cafe itself seemed to respond. Shadows deepened, and the golden light above the tables stretched, curling like smoke. The frozen patrons wavered slightly, like figures caught in an old film reel. The rain on the windows ran upward, drops reversing their fall. Thomas's chest tightened. What's happening? The waiter's expression remained calm, though his eyes gleamed faintly. Regret is a prison, but in this place, regret is also a key. The question is, do you dare use it? Thomas's breath caught. His heart thundered like a boy's again. He looked at the watch, then at the waiter, and for the first time since entering the cafe, he felt something he hadn't known in years. Not peace, not forgiveness, but a chance, just the faintest chance. Part 8. The cafe opens the door. The watch pulsed in Thomas's hand, each backward tick echoing like a heartbeat that didn't belong to him. The cafe around him trembled, as if the walls themselves were caught between past and present, neither fully here nor there. The soft jazz playing from an unseen gramophone slowed, warped, then straightened into silence. For a long moment, Thomas thought everything had stopped. But then, he saw it. The door of the cafe. It wasn't glowing the way it sometimes did when patrons left for the beyond. Tonight it shimmered differently, like a pool of rippling glass. Behind it, shadows moved, not the vague impressions of the unknown, but something sharper, something achingly familiar. A street he had walked 1,000 times in his youth. A workshop bench with the smell of varnish and oil. And then, in a flicker, the curve of a young boy's smile. Thomas gripped the table. His breath caught. The waiter followed his gaze toward the door. "It seems your watch has decided for you." The silver case in Thomas's palm was warm now, vibrating softly as if alive. The ticking grew louder, surrounding him until it drowned out every other sound. Tick, tock, backward, backward, pulling him closer to the memory he had tried to bury for decades. "I don't understand," Thomas whispered, his voice shaking. "Is this a trick? A punishment?" The waiter tilted his head. "The Café Between Lives punishes no one. It simply offers what you bring with you. You carried regret through the doorway. Now it shapes what you see. If you wish, the door will open wider." Thomas's eyes filled with tears. He shook his head in disbelief. "But what good is it? He's gone. I can't change that." "Perhaps not," the waiter replied evenly. "But a word spoken here can cross the threshold of silence. Sometimes what is too late in life is not too late in memory, or in love." Thomas stared again at the door. The shimmering glass grew clearer, and this time he saw Henry, not as a boy, not as a soldier, but as a young man in his prime. His uniform was clean, his cap tucked under one arm. He was seated at a table much like Thomas's own, head bowed, as if waiting for something. Thomas's breath shuddered in his chest. His fingers trembled around the watch. The waiter leaned forward, his voice almost a whisper. "Go to him." Thomas hesitated, torn between terror and longing. His entire body ached with the weight of what had never been said. He thought of the telegram, the boy's smile on the street, the countless times he turned away when he should have stepped forward. All the chances wasted, all the moments lost. And yet here, in this strange cafe that bent time and memory, there was one more chance. Thomas rose from his chair. The watch ticked faster now, tugging him toward the door. Each step was heavy, his legs unsteady, but his heart beat with a rhythm he had thought long gone. He reached the shimmering threshold. The air was cool, almost damp, like fog after rain. He lifted a hand toward the glass surface, and it rippled under his touch. For the first time in his life, Thomas did not turn away. Part 9. Across the table. The surface of the doorway gave way like water, and Thomas stumbled through. For a heartbeat, he felt suspended between two worlds, caught in the humming pulse of the watch, the cafe's quiet stillness behind him, and the rush of something impossibly real before him. Then his feet touched the floor. He was no longer in the Café Between Lives, at least not in the same one. This place was brighter, younger somehow. The lamps glowed with a golden sheen. The air smelled faintly of oil and leather, like his old workshop. And at the center, seated at a table near the window, was Henry. Not a vision, not a flicker of memory. Henry as solid and vivid as he had ever been. His hair was neatly combed, his uniform crisp, his face strong yet still bearing the softness of youth. He looked up, meeting Thomas's eyes. "Sit," Henry said softly. His voice was steady, calm, not accusing, just waiting. Thomas's legs felt weak, but he obeyed. He lowered himself into the chair across from his son, his trembling hands gripping the edge of the table. The watch still ticked in his palm, though its rhythm had slowed, almost gentle now, like a clock nearing rest. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Henry studied him with eyes that mirrored his own, eyes Thomas had avoided for too many years. Every second of silence was heavier than a lifetime. Finally, Thomas's voice cracked. "I should have been there. I should have said something. I should have told you who I was." Henry leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. "You watched me grow up. I remember. There were times I thought you might say it, but you never did." Thomas's chest clenched. "I was afraid of what people would say, afraid I would ruin your life before it began. I thought I was protecting you." Henry's gaze softened, though sadness lingered there. "Protecting me, or protecting yourself?" The words cut deep, but Thomas nodded slowly. His lips trembled as he whispered, "Both." The silence that followed was unbearable. Thomas felt tears burn at the corners of his eyes. His entire body seemed to fold in on itself with the weight of all those unsaid words, all the love that had rotted into regret. At last, he reached across the table. His old, weathered hand stretched toward his son. "Henry, I'm sorry, more sorry than words can carry. I failed you. I failed your mother. I failed myself. But if there is any grace left in this world, or the next, I beg you, forgive me." Henry's gaze lingered on him, steady and searching. Then, after a breath that seemed to last forever, he extended his own hand. Younger, stronger, still warm with life. He placed it gently atop his father's. "You were my father, even if you never said it," Henry whispered. "And I always knew." Thomas's tears finally broke free, rolling down his cheeks. He gripped his son's hand as though holding on to the one thing he had sought his entire life. The watch on the table gave a final tick and stopped. In the stillness, Henry smiled faintly. His form began to shimmer, the edges of his uniform glowing softly as if made of light. "Goodbye, Father," he said. His voice was tender, without anger. "Rest easy now." And then he was gone. Thomas remained frozen, his hand clutching empty air across the table. The silence was deep, but it no longer crushed him. It was a silence that held release. Slowly he picked up the pocket watch. Its hands no longer moved. The case was cool now, no longer alive with regret. He closed it gently, tucked it into his coat, and whispered to the empty chair, "Goodbye, my son." Part 10. Peace in the Silence. The cafe returned to its ordinary rhythm, as if nothing had happened, yet everything had changed. The lamps glowed warmly, the rain tapped gently against the windows, and the quiet murmur of the few remaining patrons resumed. Time, once heavy and insistent, flowed naturally again. Thomas sat for a long moment, the silver watch resting in his palm. Its ticking had stopped, and for the first time in decades, he felt weightless, not empty, not lost, but free. The burden of years, regrets, and unspoken words had been lifted, replaced by a gentle clarity he had never known. He looked around the cafe. The other patrons were unaware of the extraordinary events that had unfolded in their midst, yet Thomas could feel it. The subtle hum of the Café Between Lives acknowledging his release. The air shimmered faintly, a warm golden haze that seemed to embrace him like a long-lost friend. The waiter approached, his eyes kind but knowing. "Are you ready?" he asked softly. Thomas nodded. He rose slowly, feeling the stiffness of old bones, but also a lightness in his step. "Yes, I think I am." The doorway glowed faintly, inviting him forward. Beyond it lay the streets of the city, real and tangible, yet somehow imbued with a serenity he hadn't felt since his youth. He took a deep breath, savoring the crisp air that carried the sense of rain, earth, and something indefinably sweet. perhaps hope, perhaps forgiveness. Before stepping through, Thomas glanced back at the table where he had faced his greatest regret. The silver watch gleamed one last time in the cafe's soft light, silent now, a monument to love, loss, and the chance to make peace. He whispered, almost to himself, "Thank you." And then he stepped forward. The doorway closed gently behind him, the golden glow fading into the ordinary light of the evening streets. The cafe hummed quietly, as it always did, waiting for the next visitor, the next story, the next soul who carried a secret too heavy to bear alone. Thomas walked slowly along the rain-slicked street, feeling the heartbeat of life pulsing through him once again. Each step was lighter than the last, each breath deeper, freer. He no longer carried guilt or shame. He carried the memory of his son, yes, but it was no longer a burden. It was a treasure. As he disappeared into the city, the cafe seemed to sigh, a gentle, satisfied breath that rustled the lamps and stirred the faint mist. Somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed softly, not from the silver watch, but from the world itself, reminding him that some moments, once lost, can still be honored, and some connections, though broken by time, are never truly gone. Thomas turned a corner and paused. For a brief instant, he swore he saw Henry's smile reflected in the rain puddles, warm and fleeting, a blessing of closure he had long awaited. And in that fleeting moment, Thomas finally understood the gift he had been given, the chance to let go, the chance to forgive himself, the chance to live, unburdened at last. The Café Between Lives waited silently, its doors open for the next story, the next soul seeking redemption, the next heart carrying a secret that needed to be heard. Peace settled over Thomas like a gentle tide, and for the first time in a lifetime, he felt complete,